A Place Called Perfect, Chapter 8. A Change of Heart. Violet stopped for a moment under the gleaming gold sign, Archer's Brothers Spectacle Makers Emporium, to catch her breath. She was about to push open the painted navy door when a sudden thought hit her like a brick to the head. Her mother was right. She had IDDCS. She'd never heard of it before, but in that moment she was 100% sure she had it. Of course she was a disobedient child. Mrs. Moody was right too. How could she have broken the skipping rules like that in the middle of the schoolyard? How embarrassing! And the pencil! She blushed as she thought about the pencil. Bending down under her desk without even thinking of asking the teacher. What must the class have thought? Mrs. Moody really had tried to help her by setting that essay about rules. How did she not see it before? She really was a bold child, but all that was going to change. She turned around and walked back down Splendid Road towards home, but with each stride her reasoning weakened, and by the time she'd reached her house, she'd changed her mind again. Violet was totally confused. She wasn't bold. She'd only been trying to liven up the game, and at her old school nobody ever asked permission to pick up a pencil. Violet sat down on the stone steps at the front door of her home. Her change of mind had been so quick it was scary. What had happened to make her think that way? She retraced her steps in her head like her mother always told her to do. What had she done that was different? "The pills!" she exclaimed, jumping up so fast she knocked off her glasses. Her world went black and fuzzy. Quickly she sat back down and felt around for the frames. Something stirred on the gravel close by. Footsteps. "It's me," the familiar voice spoke hurriedly. "I know your parents are changing." It was that boy again. Just as she turned towards his voice, heavy footsteps raced across the gravel. "You!" a man growled. "I'll make sure you never set foot outside them walls again." There was a rush of feet. Violet panicked and tried to stand up to get into her house, but missed her footing and fell onto the gravel below, scraping her hands and knees. "These are yours," the boy said, pushing the glasses into her hand. She shoved them on, her heart pounding. There was no one about. The yard was empty. She turned over her hands. Her palms and knees were bloody and her grey skirt was covered in pebble dust. Was she going mad? She'd felt the boy's hand this time. Surely she hadn't imagined that. But why couldn't she see him? Who was he, and why was he following her? Was he in trouble? Who was chasing him? All these questions floated around her mind, and she knew she had to find her dad. There was something going on in Perfect, something weird, and she needed to convince him to leave. She had proof now. Bloody knees and palms should be enough to get his attention. She headed off on her third trip of the afternoon and marched back towards the Archer's Emporium. This time she didn't stop outside. She turned the polished brass knob and pushed open the door. A bell tingled above to announce her arrival. "Mr. Archer," she called. There was no reply. The shop was empty. She walked past the gleaming glass cabinets on her left to the panelled wall on the far side of the room and traced her fingers along it until they felt a familiar bump in the polished cherry wood. She pushed on the panel and the secret door opened inwards to the library beyond. Quickly she slipped inside. There were voices coming from behind a door at the opposite end of the room. She tiptoed towards them. "What are you talking about?" "We're paying you well, aren't we?" "But it's not right, Edward. Morally, I just can't do it." "You'll do as you're told, that's what you'll do." It was the Archers, and they were talking to her father. They were arguing. She hated it when adults fought, as sometimes they said horrible things to each other. It was kind of a good thing, though, as it sounded like her dad wasn't happy. Maybe he was thinking of leaving. Not daring to disturb the men, she tiptoed back towards the secret panel door. Violet Brown! She turned around quickly and stood almost nose to nose with Edward Archer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Archer. I heard voices. I was looking for my dad," she stuttered. "You're not allowed in here, young lady," Edward Archer said, nodding behind her. "It's not mannerly to snoop." "Oh, I wasn't snooping. It was an accident. I was just looking for Dad. I thought he might be in here." "He's just stepped out, Violet. I'm afraid you've missed him." "But I'm sure I heard him. He was talking to you in there." She pointed to the door behind him. "Mrs. Moody was right. You really are quite the handful," Edward Archer sighed. I'm sorry, Mr. Archer," Violet stuttered, stepping slowly backwards towards the shop. "I must have imagined it." "What happened to you, Violet?" Edward Archer asked, taking in her untidy appearance. "Are you hurt, dear?" "Oh, I fell. It's nothing." "Have you taken your pills, dear?" She stepped further back. How did he know? "Your mother told me," he smiled, as if reading her mind. "IDDCS, a serious condition, Violet. It mustn't go untreated." Her heart was beating rapidly now. "What's going on here?" snapped George Archer, stepping into the library behind his brother. "Nothing," Edward smiled. "Violet here was looking for her father. She's just leaving." "He's not here," George said, glaring down at Violet. "I know. Edward told me," Violet stammered. Then she turned and ran. There was something about George, something that made her nervous whenever she was near him. Once outside, and a safe distance from the shop, she stopped to breathe. Why did Edward Archer know all that stuff about Mrs. Moody and the pills? Why was he sticking his nose in her life? And her dad, why had they lied about her dad? She was sure it was him behind that door, and he'd sounded angry. Why wouldn't they tell her the truth? Avoiding home, she walked up Edward Street. The past few hours played over in her mind. First it was her mother and the pills, then her strange change of heart, her glasses, the voice, the Archers, their odd behaviour, and her dad. There was something up with her dad. A group of women chatting outside the Hatchett family butcher's fell silent as she walked by. She could have sworn she heard one of them whisper, "IDDCS." She crossed the road at the town hall and passed the Archer's tea shop, resting in its shadows. A new display of beautiful hand-painted china cups decorated the window. She stopped for a look and noticed everyone in the busy shop had turned to stare out at her. Quickly she continued on and turned left down Archers Avenue, avoiding the eyes of Edward Street. Spying a bench by the high stone wall, she sat down to think. What was going on in Perfect? Violet knew her mother wouldn't listen. Her man didn't care what Violet thought anymore. Her dad wouldn't listen either. He'd be angry with her for speaking around the Archers. She was sure Edward would tell him all about it. Her dad was strict when it came to manners, and she hadn't been at all polite to Edward Archer. She looked up from the bench. She'd been on this street before. On the wall, almost directly opposite, was that sign. The original home place of Messrs. George and Edward Archer, first sons of Perfect. The words "and William" etched in above the letters. She wondered if William Archer had scratched his own name into the sign and under her desk in school. If he did, It seemed he was a troublemaker, just like everyone thought she was. Why had she never heard about him before? Maybe he'd left Perfect. Maybe he'd hated the town just as much as she did. Goose pimples prickled her skin as she wondered what had happened to William Archer. End of chapter 8.